Hey there. Thank you so much for joining us for a special joint simulcast of Zoom into Books with our friends at Headline Books, and also the Big Time Talker podcast brought to you by our friends at speakermatch.com, the world's largest online virtual speakers bureau. If you're a platform speaker, maybe you're a meeting planner, these in-person meetings are now getting back to normal post-pandemic. Contact one another at speakermatch.com. Speakermatch.com, proud to sponsor the broadcast today. And I'm proud to welcome in my old friend, David Dorsen. He's, an author, but he's much more than that. If the name sounds familiar, David first came to national prominence as a prosecutor, won a measure of fame, at least to us news wonks, as a top attorney for the Senate Watergate Committee. And he's just written this new book about an incredible miscarriage of justice. It's called Judicial Mayhem, How Federal Judges Betrayed Their Public Trust. It's a fascinating account of David's very last big courtroom case. And you will walk away, I think, after this conversation, shaking your head and maybe just a little bit frightened about what could happen. David Dorsen, welcome to the program. Thanks for being here. It's good to see you.
My pleasure. Good to see you again, Bert.
My man. You have gone and written a book about your last big case, and I want to sort of paint the background here for folks about who the case involved, and there are a lot of intricacies there, so we don't want to get too far into the weeds, but what can happen if you wind up being on the bad side of the court system. So let me start with this. The case involved a gentleman named Michael Lauer. Tell me about Michael.
Well, Michael Lauer, first of all, is unusual in that he encountered the court system as a multi-millionaire and not as a minority or poor person, and yet the courts destroyed him financially. Michael Lauer was born behind the Iron Curtain, speaking no English. He came to the United States at the age of 15 with his mother and learned English, worked his way through college by driving a taxi mostly, decided with some help from family friends to go into finance, which he thought would be absolutely crazy, but he went to work for several different large financial firms and finally became a hedge fund manager because he felt he could do a good job. And over the course of the 1990s primarily, he went from maybe a millionaire to bare millionaire to worth over $100 million. And then, unfortunately for him, the FBI and the SEC descended on him for reasons which I try to explain in the book, but are really inexplicable.
So, David, Michael then sounds almost like the American dream. I mean, a kid that got here as a young teen, didn't speak a word of English, and worked his way up. I'm sure he didn't just become a millionaire. He started at the very bottom in that industry, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it is the American dream. As I said, he spoke no English. He fled from behind the Iron Curtain. He was half Jewish, but was brought up Jewish. His mother was a daughter of a Russian general. His father was a Jew in Poland who escaped the Holocaust by becoming, in effect, another person. And the two parents met in university and went ahead. And then that was from poor beginnings, he went to the top of the world where he was racing cars with Paul Newman on his team, the actor and director, flying his own plane, doing incredible work with various organizations that helped him settle in the United States, and became one of the leading philanthropists in New York.
Our guest is David Dorsen. David's written this new book called Judicial Mayhem. It's in bookstores everywhere from our friends at Headline Books, and of course available at Amazon.com, HeadlineBooks.com, wherever books are sold. David, you had a long and very successful legal career, both in New York City and here where we met in Washington, D.C. And you really didn't have anything to prove in your career when you took this case on. And And you write in the book, this was sort of your last big case. What was it that drew you to this case? Why did you decide to take this on?
Excuse me. Well, what happened was that Michael Lauer had been assaulted. I use perhaps exaggeration, but mentally he was assaulted by the SEC and FBI. A judgment had been entered into against him of $62 million. That was totally unwarranted. They accused him of inflating the price of stocks, and they had no evidence that I could see that it remotely justified it. And but he had no money, so he was without an attorney. Someone he knew in Florida and would have represented him briefly knew a lawyer in New York named in Washington named Alan Gerson, who knew me because we'd worked together, and asked me if I would get involved in this case. I looked at it and decided that even though economically it was probably going to be a loser, that I just couldn't stand by and see an American citizen like Michael Lauer being mishandled by the government, the SEC, Department of Justice, and especially the courts. So I just went in there. We signed a document that gave us money only on a contingency basis if we won, and then with some other requirements. Needless to say, I've never seen a dime. I spent $2 million worth of my time on it, $25,000 out of pocket. Lauer went from over $100 million to literally zero.
Is Michael Lauer still alive today? I mean, did he make it through this?
Yes, of course. He's been barred by the miscarriage of justice that resulted in the $62 million judgment against him. He was also enjoined from participating in any most financial transactions, and he's just living out his life in an apartment in New Jersey, as far as I know.
David Dorsen is the author of Judicial Mayhem. There's a great review on Amazon that says this just might be the most amazing legal thriller you've never heard. And we hope to change that now as we talk about the book Judicial Mayhem. And people are singing its praises. People like John Dean, who, of course, you shared the spotlight in Watergate with, a former U.S. Congresswoman, Elizabeth Holtzman, who was a district attorney in Brooklyn, says of this book, it's an important account of how the federal court system can malfunction. Everyone concerned about fair-handed justice should read this. Did you lose your faith in the federal court system in the process of representing Lauer?
Not really. I was an assistant U.S. attorney for 5 years under legendary Robert M. Morgenthau. My first book was on Judge Henry Friendly, a Court of Appeals judge, and I dedicated the book to the judges of the United States Courts of Appeals. And I still have respect for an overwhelming majority of federal judges who mostly are underpaid and overworked. But I just found this so extraordinary. The sheer number of outrageous things. Just as I mentioned, I think, Michael Lauer was sued by the SEC in a civil enforcement action. Before he learned that the suit had been filed, he had been deprived of every penny he had, even money that he earned long before the alleged fraud. They had seized control of his two companies and put them in receivership. They had seized control of his hedge funds, the innocent hedge funds, and put them in receivership with the same receiver that was a receiver for his companies. What this meant, and it was talking about before he learned about the case was being filed, that the same receiver, a lawyer in Florida with no experience running companies, was going to be on both sides of the transactions. He was going to be the receiver for the companies that were sued, along with Michael Lauer, the management companies, and the receiver for the hedge funds, the investors who were supposedly defrauded. So that we had an impossible situation, which Michael Lauer, to his credit, repeatedly brought up to the courts, and they came up with some convoluted explanations that there's really no conflict here because he only represents one person. It was bizarre, and it kept getting worse and worse. It was unbelievable to somebody who had by that point had spent 50 years practicing law and had worked as an Assistant U.S. Attorney and Assistant Chief Counsel of the Senate Watergate Committee. And it's really an incredible story. I've tried to make it as accessible as possible. And the people who are not lawyers have read it and told me they followed it and were appalled by it. And I was appalled by it. I spent 5 years trying to set aside the $62 million judgment. And it's no secret that I lost badly.
Yeah, it's this did not come out as well as one would have expected. Judicial Mayhem is the book. David Dorsen is the author. If you love legal thrillers, this one may put John Grisham or Daniel Baldacci to shame. I mean, this is real life stuff, but it reads like something that's made up.
Well, I wouldn't. I actually have written a novel, and I wouldn't even try to make up a story like this. What is astonishing is, as I told you, that was all before he was sued, and it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. Not only did they deprive him of an attorney, they told him under court, district judge told him he could not interview witnesses. So here's a man who's had no legal background, grew up in actually Poland, deprived of an attorney, fighting both the SEC and the receiver, who was now told he could not defend himself properly. I mean, it is incredible. And as I said, I would not have dared to write a novel with all this in it. It was the Chinese water torture for Michael Lauer and for me as I got into it and familiarized myself with it. And I just have to emphasize, I've never seen anything remotely like this. And it was 2 federal district judges and 6 or 7 Court of Appeals judges, because we kept trying to get the Court of Appeals to reverse the judgment. And as I said, I was totally unsuccessful.
I've got to ask you this, and you're an attorney. Clearly, I am not. But you mentioned something there that he had to represent himself. And any Yahoo like me who's watched an episode of Law and Order, they read the rights, and one of the first things you hear the officer tell the perp is you've got a right to an attorney. Without getting too far into the legalese of it, David, how does that work? Where they say you don't even get counsel?
Well, what happens is this. First of all, this was a civil enforcement case, not a criminal case. In a criminal case, he was later prosecuted, which is another horrendous thing that happened to him. He was acquitted, I should add, and he had no money, so he had a public defender in a complex SEC case, and he got acquitted.
Wow.
In criminal cases, you get an attorney, sometimes good, sometimes bad. In civil cases, it is much, much more complicated, and trying to maybe oversimplify it, he should have been able to use his own untainted money that he acquired before he alleged fraud, which was not until around 2000 when they said it began, and couldn't give a reason why a man of his wealth would suddenly commit crimes. But be that as it may, the judge, relying on a narcotics case, a horrendous narcotics case, said, well, all the money's intermingled, and therefore we won't try to separate it, and goodbye, you don't get any of the money, and you have to represent yourself.
Incredible. The book is Judicial Mayhem. If you love legal thrillers, you've got to pick this one up. It's a real life account of a gentleman named Michael Lauer. John Dean, who was a former counsel to President Nixon, made famous in the Watergate trial, and himself a very accomplished author, says this about the book. Michael Lauer's dream, and the American dream we talked about, became a nightmare. An overzealous Securities and Exchange Commission and misguided Department of Justice targeted him. The American judicial system failed Michael Lauer by trashing the rule of law. David, there may be folks who are listening in to our conversation about Michael Lauer right now saying, you know what, rich guy, multimillionaire hedge fund manager, so what? rich guy gets what's coming to him. But it didn't just affect him. It affected an awful lot of people.
Absolutely. And it affected everyone who worked for him, even though none of them was ever sued by the SEC. It affected the people who entrusted him with money. Over $1 billion he had under management. And
that's $1 billion with a B.
Billion with a B, and they lost something like 95% of their wealth in investment as it became greater because he was a great hedge fund manager and won awards. And in fact, there's a book about various people on Wall Street, investment advisors and the like, with a chapter on him that praised we won awards for being successful. And then they said, because what he would do, just briefly, was that he would find startups and invest in them, and then take buy up their stock, which he had arranged to be purchased at whatever low price he could get it. And he would do this. And his record was, if you look at it like a football team, not great. And he probably lost more than he won. But when he won it, it was something like a Facebook or Microsoft, or not.
When he won big, really big.
He won big, and he was making. He was making profits when no one else was making profits, and the SEC used the fact that he was so good and making profits when no one else was making profits as evidence that he was a crook, and the judge accepted it on their word without any evidence of it, even though they were required to do. The SEC had the burden of proof.
Is there a reason in your mind why, it almost sounds conspiratorial, why they went after him so hard? Was he, for example, is Michael Lauer, and I don't want to overstep bounds here, is he an unlikable guy? Did they need a villain? I mean, why? Why did they come after him so hard?
I think on the, again, it's speculation. I try to speak to people all over, judges, the prosecutors, the SEC people. No one would talk to me, so I was shut out of getting anyone's explanation. I believe that they were that what had happened was this: that a sting had been set up called Bermuda Short, that to entice corrupt people in the financial world to invest in crooked enterprises, and Lauer turned them down. Some people who knew Lauer, he turned them down multiple times. There's no evidence that he's a bad person, but be that as it may, other people who knew Lauer, including some who were consultants, were trapped, and to make a deal and save their skins, they made up things about Lauer. And the FBI looked into it, couldn't prove anything, so they gave it to the SEC through irregular channels. Rather than send it back to Washington and have the Washington deal with the SEC nationally, the Miami-based or Florida-based FBI, what they did was they just called up the SEC, local SEC in Miami, and the Miami SEC did it all on its own. And they were totally inexperienced, inept, gullible. I can go on for the adjectives, but that I think is the case on the ground floor with the SEC. They just thought Michael Lauer was a crook. They were dying for a big case. They called it one of the biggest frauds in the history of Florida and the world, maybe. And but when it got to the district judges, they were the first district judge, I think, was just unable to accept Lauer as a person, and was overwhelmed by these false things that the SEC was telling him. The second district judge, I think, was just way in over his head. When it got to the Court of Appeals, and I think they just threw up their hands and did whatever they were asked to do by the SEC or the Department of Justice. On the Court of Appeals level, I think it's different. The Court of Appeals was faced with a situation 6 or 7 years after the case was filed, where there was a $62 million judgment against Lauer. The hedge funds in the meantime had been virtually destroyed. And the Court of Appeals, I believe, felt, one, that there was no way, if they reversed, there was nothing they could do about it. I mean, it's just like he was executed financially.
Right.
They said he was mistaken. What are we going to do about it? There was just no way to correct it. The other thing is that the overzealous SEC had painted such a negative picture of Lauer, and a disagreement between Lauer and me came out into the open over a brief I wanted to file, in which he accused me of something wrong that I didn't do. So to try to simplify it, there were two problems. One was that there was no way of correcting the mistakes that had been made in the district court, because the receiver had sold off all of the assets of the hedge funds at ridiculously low prices, and it spent ultimately tens of millions of dollars of the hedge funds' money to try to prove that Lauer was guilty. The other thing was that there may have been personal animus against Lauer and against me that contributed to the inexplicable actions of the Court of Appeals in throwing out the case. And ultimately, the last time around, they threw out the case on their own motion. In other words, it's not unusual for a party in a Court of Appeals, it happens sometimes, it's not the usual case, to move to dismiss a case. Well, the Court of Appeals dismissed it without being asked to dismiss it. And again, I don't want to attribute evil motives. There certainly was no bribery or anything like that. And there's absolutely no suggestion. These were competent and, I believe, honest in the sense of the monetary sense of judges, but they acted so outrageously that I just gasped as I went along. I literally gasped.
Do you have any idea how many, when you put together, his employees and people who had their life savings, under Michael Lauer, how many people, average Americans, just, lost it all because of this, the government going after Lauer? Are we talking 10 people? Are we talking 100 people? Talking more?
Well, there were probably close to 10 who worked for him. And there were literally hundreds of investors. Some were really big shots, which, like Morgan Stanley invested money with him, and there never were complaints about Lauer. That's another thing. Morgan Stanley, for example, and other large entities, along with certain individuals, invested. There was never a complaint. They were happy. He was oversubscribed. No one thought he had done anything wrong. He had been doing the same thing for 10 or 15 years. And no one could explain why suddenly in the year 2000, Lauer had become a crook for relatively small potatoes. I mean, he was getting a percentage of the value of the hedge funds and the increase in value of the hedge funds. But by that time, he was a multi-millionaire, and they never could come up with an explanation.
Most folks, David, probably are comparing in their heads right now this case to the one that got all the press, the Bernie Madoff case.
Right.
And I wonder if you could sort of compare and contrast Madoff and Lauer, and both as people, but also how those cases laid out.
Well, Bernie Madoff was a self-admitted crook. He pleaded guilty of billions of dollars of outrageous Ponzi scheme. And Michael Lauer was an honest person who started out with nothing. And as I say, and I try to show it, that there was no proof that he did anything wrong. And I personally believe he did nothing illegal. Lauer, I think, antagonized the judges in the district court. by being aggressive, which I can't say I blame him.
Well, yeah, the guy's fighting for his life.
He was fighting for his life. He made motion after motion for money for an attorney, for support. His mother, who lived with him, had multiple illnesses. She was over 80 years old. And at one point, Lauer said, she suffered a stroke. We need the money. I need to release some of the funds to get her care, because I've been doing it. I just can't do it because I'm also defending myself in this case. And the judge dismisses, well, there's nothing new here, denied. And there was and especially in the Court of Appeals, they wouldn't really deal with my arguments. In the Court of Appeals, many of the arguments were mine. In the district court, in the first round, when the judgment was entered against Lauer, he was there alone. He said after I lost the first time in the Court of Appeals, I went back to the district court to try to get it reversed, but nothing worked. I mean, it was at one point, and actually I didn't put this in the book because there was so much. The SEC or receiver tried to enjoin me from filing more motions. And the only thing he could cite was that I filed a lot of motions. Of course, I filed a lot of motions. There were a lot of mistakes. And he cited no authority. And the district judge, rather than throw it out, denied it without prejudice, saying it's now before the Court of Appeals. I don't want to interfere, thereby giving it some credibility. And as I said, there was no authority. They didn't deal with any single argument of mine. I'm not saying I did a great job. I have no idea how good a job I did. All I can say is I tried hard, and I think I was right, but I lost.
David Dorsen's book is Judicial Mayhem, and it's very aptly titled. So this is an amazing story that the hair's kind of standing up on my arms right now as I think about this. And you put yourself in this guy's place, and it's a scary place to be. I should probably point out to people that should they think in listening to this conversation with you that you're the guy that is always in there on the defense, and you're defending these white collar criminals and bad guys. Early in your career, you were the guy that went after the bad guys.
Absolutely, I was a prosecutor for 5 years, and if I had a specialty in the U.S. Attorney's Office, it was going after proceeding into criminal tax cases. I know my mentality is more of a prosecutor than a defense attorney, and I felt more or less like a prosecutor in Watergate. We were trying to find out what had happened after the break-in and what became a massive cover-up. So I come to these things more with a prosecutorial state of mind, and I think people should read this because the federal courts, by and large, are terrific. They have good judges. Sometimes they are ideologues, as with, in my opinion, in recent years. But by and large, these are competent, bright, conscientious judges who do a good job and are overworked and underpaid. And yet, this happened to somebody who was a multi-millionaire, and it's chilling. And one of the problems I dealt with or try to deal with in my mind, and to some extent in the book, is what can you do about it? And perhaps the main thing you can do is make sure people are aware this can happen. Keep in mind, I've worked 4 or 5 years on a case, lost badly, couldn't do a thing for this poor man. And it's hard to know what I could have done more. Someone else may know, but you have to expose these things. They have to see the light. People have to read about them and understand what really can go wrong and keep their eyes open for it. It's a very difficult situation.
Going to court is not it's not like Perry Mason. It's quite a bit different when you're actually in there mixing it up. I wonder, David, if as you look back on that, if you were to find yourself in a situation like that, or someone who's listening finds themselves in a situation Well, what are the takeaways? What did you learn from this whole thing that might be applicable moving forward if you find yourself on the bad end of this kind of deal?
Well, that's a very good and very tough question. Perhaps the most important thing is just to recognize what can happen, that you cannot assume that everyone's going to behave as they do in Perry Mason or some of the other fanciful stories, that these judges are human, that and at times you're going to lose, and inexplicably. There's something called the Innocence Project, which reviews cases in which innocent people were convicted, and in some cases sentenced to death. And all you can do is shine light on it, be conscious of it, talk about it, try to get help, try to get a good lawyer, and just pray that you don't run into a judge like Lauer ran into.
Yeah, you're pretty upfront about saying, and your exact words, I think, were, "I lost, and I lost badly." Do you have any regrets that this was your last big case and that you took this on to begin with?
Well,
you wish you wouldn't have.
I know. Obviously, I wish things had gone better. As I said, I'm not sure what I could have done that would have made a significant difference. But I don't regret it because, for one thing, people don't hear about cases like this. I just don't know of any book like it. Lawyers don't write about cases they lose. I mean, it's
right.
It's not good for business, among other things. But so that I feel that I did something constructive. As I said, it was very expensive to me, very debilitating, very frustrating. But I'm glad I did it because, no, I would do it again. I would do it again. I said I would do it again, and maybe something a little different here, a little different there in retrospect. But I was doing it essentially by myself, and I was doing the best I could. And in some places, I can say I did a good job. In other cases, I just don't know. And with whether somebody else could have won, well, the short answer is I don't think anyone else would have taken the case. You have to be crazy to take the case.
So does that make you crazy? That's the question.
Well, I'll leave that for others to say.
Our guest is David Dorsen. This incredible book is Judicial Mayhem. And you did something really unique with this book. You teamed up with your publisher, Headline Books, and you talked about wanting to let people know what could happen. You took what I think is probably a pretty unprecedented step in mailing a copy of this book. And if I get this wrong, tell me, but you mailed one to every federal judge in America.
No, I have to say that's a little overstated. I sent it to every federal court of appeals judge in the hundreds. I sent it to the chief judge of every district court, where there were many more hundred, paying out of my own pocket for the books that I was sent out and the postage and everything else. So I sent out 300-400 books to judges. I sent it to other people, but I felt that perhaps the best way of getting the story across and the most important audience for the story were the judges themselves. I was throwing, in a sense, good money after bad after I lost the case, but I was prepared to do something because not only did I spend a couple of years writing the book, and it's deeply sourced. Just about everything I say is an endnote which says the document 2,127, page 6, and there were that many documents in the case file. But I just wanted to get it across, and I thought long and hard about to who to send it. And I said, this is the audience that wants it most, and maybe they'll talk about it with their friends and lawyer friends and all that. But it was something I did, and cost me more thousands of dollars.
David Dorsen is the author of Judicial Mayhem. I want to ask you about something that doesn't have to do with this book. I found it fascinating. I was reading about you. Did I get this right? You filed a libel suit against G. Gordon Liddy?
Well, what happened, yes and no. I worked on a libel suit. What happened was that John Dean and Maureen Dean, well, Well, there were two suits. The first one, John Dean and Maureen Dean, sued Liddy and others for Liddy's and others in the book's allegations that John Dean was really the person who orchestrated the break-in of the Democratic National Headquarters, which was false, and other outrageous things, that there was a prostitution ring going on among the Democratic National Committee and the like. I joined that when the case was transferred from the West Coast to the East Coast. And I was sort of the East Coast lawyer, and I took depositions of people like Liddy and Charles Colson and others. The other case was also filed by somebody else in my office, and I took it over, where a secretary in the Democratic National Committee, who was accused of being the scheduler for the prostitutes and other things, sued Liddy alone for this story. And the first case was settled to everyone's satisfaction, to our satisfaction. Well, the second case, I lost on a technicality, because even though I strongly disagreed and thought we had a good, strong case, the jury concluded, after this was the second trial, the first trial ended without a decision one way or the other, a hung jury. But the jury in the second case said that it wasn't clearly enough about the plaintiff. It talked about it referred to the plaintiff, but it didn't really libel her. And I don't know what to make of it. I thought it was pretty clear. There was an argument they made. I thought it was weak. Liddy had his fans, just like people like that have their fans today. He was sort of a right-wing ideologue and a conspiracy thinker. And I lost.
Did that make you nervous, taking on a guy like that who,
No.
I mean, were you looking over your shoulder every time you went to the parking garage?
Well, to be candid, no. No, and I don't mean to say that there are not a lot of people who are vulnerable, who are law enforcement and judges. I mean, it's what's going on is terrible. But in my case, I did not feel that I was in any danger, personal danger. And what would I have done if I thought I was the personal danger? I don't know. It's not a pleasant. No, then again, it was just a couple of days ago that Paul Pelosi was beaten by an ideologue at his home in California, and this is just the spouse of a public official. And you say, who's safe in this country? What's going on? And I have no idea. It is just scary. It is so scary.
And you're right. And I should point out, if you're not familiar with David or his works, one of his other books was about one of his best friends in life. And that book is called The Unexpected Scalia, Conservative Justice's Liberal Opinions. So even though you guys didn't line up politically, you were the best of friends.
We were close friends. We had dozens of dinners together with wives, and traveled together to Ireland and did a couple of other things. Went to baseball games and horse races. I'll confess that I owned 1/3 interest or 1/4 interest at different times of it in a racing stable, but that's another story. I was also wine and food editor of the Washingtonian magazine during much of this time, which is another story. But Scalia was, I thought, with a couple of exceptions, intellectually honest and very fair and willing to discuss things. And we had some great times.
David Dorsen, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. It's always good to see you, my friend.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed this.
The book is Judicial Mayhem, and I can't recommend it enough. I love fictional legal thrillers. This one may be better than any of those. The subtitle is How Federal Judges Betrayed Their Public Trust. It's available from our friends at Headline Books at Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, HeadlineBooks.com. Wherever great books are sold, you can go in and ask for it by name. Again, it's Judicial Mayhem by David Dorsen. David, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us today for Zoom into Books and the Big Time Talker podcast, brought to you by Speaker Match. From our studios here in Washington, D.C., I'm Burke Allen. Go out there and make it a great day. Thanks for being here. Bye, everybody.